let's go back to this category 1 table. If I look at this table in design view, it shows me my field names and my data type that I picked. But you'll notice that down below, this field properties window, this is where I can set some of the other properties for these fields. So for example, if you look back at table 1 in your assignment, it says that the category ID, it says the field size is 5. So the field size is one of the properties that's shown down here in this window. So if I change this, I can change this to 5 down here. And then there's another field that says it's required.
How do you get to that screen?
Pardon?
How do you get to that screen that you're on?
From a table. If I right-click on a table and I select Design View, that brings me to this particular.
Okay, thanks.
So when I highlight a particular field like cat ID, I'll see its properties. And the properties you see down here at the bottom are going to be different or can be different depending on the data type. So in this table, both of them are short text, so the property list is going to be the same. So the other property that we need to set for this is we need to set this required property to yes, because again, in table 1, under the comments, it says that cat ID is required. Okay. So I set the field size to 5. I set is required to yes. That means that when somebody's putting in a new record into this table, they must supply a value. Otherwise, Access will not allow you to create a brand new record. The other thing about this field is that this category ID, we want this to be the primary key for this table because it's supposed to be the unique value. So with this field selected, you'll see there's a primary key button up here. And when I select that, a little gold key symbol appears here. So this tells me that this field is now part of the primary key. In fact, it's the only field that's part of the primary key. And just to repeat, the primary key ensures uniqueness. So if I try to enter 2 records with the same value in this field, Access will reject it. It won't allow me to create that second record. For category description, it indicated that the field size is 50, and it's also required. So I'm just double clicking here to flip that from no to yes. And then I'm going to save changes to here. This message is just telling me that since we changed the field size, it's basically telling me there's a risk that you could potentially lose some of your data because you changed the size. It's not going to affect us here because the category ID is always 5 and the category description is always 50 or fewer. But if they were longer, some of it could potentially get cut off. So we'll say yes here, we're aware of that fact. And then it says, if you have real large tables, sometimes this process can take a long time changing the field size. In this case, it's just going to be a breeze here. So let's go back to, let's see. All right, hang on here. All right, let's see what's in this category table. Okay. So is this some of the stuff you were encountering yesterday? Let me look back. So it looks like I've got some extra junk in here for some reason. Let me just get rid of these extra junk tape, these extra rows here. Okay, that should be fine. I'll go back to design view. So I'm going to change. So that's 5. That's good. It's required is yes. That's 50. It's required is yes. And now let's see. We should be able to make this the primary key now. And then save the table. Okay. So the problem was I had 2 blank rows. And it saw 2 blank rows and said, well, you've got a blank for category ID for these 2 rows. You can't do that. And again, it's sort of, I don't know what the right term is, like wonky sometimes, where when you're importing data from Excel, sometimes you get this noise that comes in with it and you just have to try to clean it up. I'm sure that if your instructor was going through these imports, that's probably what he was encountering when he was going through that. I know that's not what you want to hear because it can add difficulty to your task of trying to get data, but you know, it is what it is. We just have to kind of deal with it. Okay, does anybody have any questions on that one?
I'm good. That was pretty explanatory.
I'm going to go to the cookie table. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm looking at your assignment. This is table 2. So it says the cookie ID, it should be a primary key, which it is. The data type is number, and if you see down below, it is long integer. A primary key is always going to be a long integer value, so you don't have to change that. And then it says it should be required. You'll see that it's down here, it's already set to required because a primary key is always required, so you don't need to change that from ODS. And then in the comments, it says we set the format property to 0000, in other words, 4 digits. Okay, and it actually picked that up on its own. By looking at the data, it was able to pick up that there's 4 digits to that. Okay, so we should be good on this particular field. On the cookie name field, again, you'll notice that the field size is 50, so I change that to 50. And it says it's required, so we're going to double click that. You can also click on this little arrow here to select yes or no, but because there's only yes or no values, double clicking toggles between the two. Category ID is text, which is 25. And I found this kind of interesting because category ID in the category table was only set to 5. But for whatever reason, it says 25 in this table. So we're going to go with what it says there. This is also a required field. And then finally for the cost, because it's currency, it's already set properly here. So all we need to do on this one is set the required property to yes. And then we should be able to save this table. Again, you might see this message because we changed the data size on one of the fields. But it should not have any impact on saving the table. Okay, so we'll just take a look at it. So there's all of our records. Okay, and what you'll notice here, a little bit later on, we have to set up relationships between the table. But I want you to notice that in the cookie table, there's actually a reference to the category ID. So this is what we're going to use to get us back to the category for that particular product. So TN001, if we look that up in the category table, that happens to be a 1 pound tin. Okay? But that's how we create relationships between the tables. The first step is to have a field like we have here, category ID, that will allow us to then look back to the category table and look up the appropriate value. Okay. We'll save those changes there. Okay. I think the seller table was pretty straightforward. Seller this time. Okay, column headings. So now I'm looking at table 3 in the assignment. So the seller ID is going to be a long integer. So I'm going to change that to long integer. Seller first name is text, so that's okay. The last name is text, so that's okay. And then the grade, it says it is a byte data type. So I'm going to select byte. And that indicates that the value can be between 0 and 255. But it cannot be less than 0 and it cannot be greater than 255. The reason we're using this particular data type is because the grade, it's going to be 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's always going to be a very small value. So we don't need a long integer, which can hold up to 4 billion or something. That's just too much space. We don't need to store that much information. So we're using a smaller data type called byte, which again holds values from 0 to 255. So that's most appropriate for this field. With text. So this one tells you explicitly that the seller ID serves as the primary key. So we're going to just go and choose seller ID from this here. And then I'll change this to seller 1. And let's see if we have any issues with this one. Okay, that one's pretty clean. So now I have my seller 1 table. And again, I need to clean up some of these properties, which I can only do in this design view. So seller ID is the primary key, it's number, it's a long integer, and it's required, so that's all good. The seller first name has to be 25, and it is required. Last name is 50, and is required. And then finally, grade is required. Okay, so we have the correct data type. So here you see that grade is a number data type, but down below you see that specifically it's a byte. So again, a number could be an integer, a long integer, a double, which is one that contains fractional units, or it can be a byte. So there's several different numeric data types. You should always pick the one that's most appropriate for the data that you're going to be storing in that field. Okay, we'll click save here. Okay, that's fine. Okay, now, so this is what I had to do for the checkout table. This is in table 4. I want to go back to the data. Let's see. Okay, so what I noticed about the checkout table was that it has a field called checkout ID, and you'll see that the data type is set access in this case to assign the primary key number. When I first opened up the file that Sabrina sent, there was a column here. The first column was labeled checkout ID. I deleted that column because we're going to let Microsoft Access automatically assign the values for us. Okay. And again, if you have a checkout ID column, if it wasn't an auto number, if it was just a regular number field, I would go ahead and import it. But since in this case, this table says we're going to let Microsoft Access assign that value, then I'm not going to import it. And with each one of these rows that gets imported, when this row gets imported, it's going to get the value 1. This one gets imported, it gets the value 2, and so forth, right? 2, 3, 4, and so on. So Microsoft Access will just give each new record that gets placed into that table
A little confusing, I guess, but
okay. Let me. Here I save this.
but I guess as long as somebody in the group gets it, we can ask. So
Let me show you the original file, and it will make more sense because I already modified your file. So let me find where you sent me files. Okay, so here's the original file. Let's see if it'll let me open it because I already have something open with the same name. Okay, so here's your original file. You see this checkout ID?
yes.
Okay, so this is the primary key for this table. However, we're going to let Microsoft Access assign the IDs, so we don't want to import this column. So what I did to make sure that the records were going to be in the appropriate order is I sorted this. I first sorted it by this first column, right, so that I would have the records in the exact same order that they had been inserted. When you have an auto number field, again, everything is sequential. So the first record would get ID 1, ID 2, ID 3, etc. So I wanted to put these in the same order that they would be inserted into the database. That's why I ordered them by the checkout ID. And then the next thing I did was, after I ordered by checkout ID, I simply took that column out with the idea that Microsoft Access is going to fill in the blanks for us.
So delete the column. So you sorted it and then deleted it? Is that
I sorted by checkout ID,
right?
and then I deleted column A, leaving only cookie ID, seller ID, checkout date, and quantity, as you see here.
Okay.
Because if I tried to import it, it would actually wind up creating a primary key and another column called checkout ID. Now I'd have two columns and it would be confusing. So I just got rid of the column because I thought it would be easier to import the data that way. So when I did that, I'll go to external data, copy. Okay, so I'm going to import to the table. This goes in the checkout table. Okay, so there's my columns. Okay, now again, I'm looking at the structure of the table here. So I have the cookie ID is going to be a long integer. So I'm going to change that to long integer. The seller ID is going to be a long integer. Checkout date, so that's fine. We'll leave that one as it is. And then checkout quantity, again, we're going to change this to a byte because the checkout quantity is expected to be very small. It's not going to be 1,000. It's going to be some relatively small number. So that's why we're using the byte data type. Okay. I'm going to let access add the primary key in this case, right? So this ultimately, I'm going to change this column. When we're done, it'll say checkout ID instead of just ID. But you can see how the records are going to be assigned to the ID, right?
Okay.
And I'm going to put this in checkout 1, finish. Okay. So now if we go to checkout 1, there's our records. Okay, and there's our primary key. So what we need to do, as we've done with the other tables, is I'm going to look at this in design view, and I'm going to change the name of this field to say checkout ID to match the field name in the assignment. And you can see it's an auto number. Again, because it's a primary key, you can see the primary key symbol here. It's going to be a required field, so there's nothing I need to do to change that. But for the cookie ID, the long integer, which it is, it should be a required field. Seller ID should also be a long integer and required. Checkout date is a date time, so all we need to do is change that to required. And then finally, the checkout quantity, we need to change that to is required as well. Just as a reminder, what that means is when you go to create a new record, Access is going to enforce that you have something filled out in each one of these fields because all of them in the table are required. You can have a field that's not required. For example, if you're storing an address, you might have address line 1 and address line 2, right? Where address line 2 could be an apartment number or a suite number, and it's not always going to be there. So in that case, you wouldn't make it a required field. So you would leave the required set to no, and if you left it empty, Access doesn't care. It would just save the record with an empty value. Okay? All right, and we have one last table, the sales table. So I think this one was fairly straightforward too. Let's see. No, this one also has an auto number. So let's check the data file. Okay, so let's sell that. I'm sorry, save. Okay, so this one is okay because there is no field in the data file that's called sales ID, so I don't have to delete a column like I did before. So we're just going to let Microsoft Access create that primary key, and when we get to the design view, we'll change the name of it to sales ID. So that's how it differed from the checkout table, where there was that additional column in there. So for this one, you don't actually have to modify the data file at all. We're just going to go ahead and import it as it is. Data, import, sales. Okay. All right, so this ref number is a long integer. I'm looking at table 5 now, the page that's labeled 120. Seller ID is a long integer. That's the date, that's last. Quantity sold, we're going to change that to a byte. This one should be currency. So here's where we're going to let Access create that key value for us. And when we're done, we'll change the name of this from ID to sales ID. Sales ID. All of the fields in this table are required, so I'm just going to change the required field to yes for all of these. And okay, so that's how I imported the tables. Now, in the worst case scenario, if you couldn't get an import to work, you could always create the table ahead of time and then try to import the file into it using the append instead of having to create a new table. But it shouldn't be that difficult. It's just in a couple of cases you had to do something a little bit different in order to okay. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create relationships between the tables and the database, because later on we're going to need that for building forms and also for creating queries. We've got a bunch of questions that he's got on the page that's labeled 124. So in order to answer those questions, you're going to have to wind up writing queries. And a query is something that you create to extract data from a database. So for example, let's say you had a table called customers. I could say, select all the records from customers where the state is California. And that query will return back just that subset of records that match the filter. If I change the filter to where the state is Illinois, then of course the result set's going to be different, because now I'll be looking at the customers that are in the state of Illinois. So we write queries when we want to extract things from the database to help us answer questions about the data in the database. Okay? But before you can do that, you will need to create relationships between your tables. I'm going to show you how to do that. So under Database Tools tab, there's a button called Relationships. And I'm going to get rid of all these so that I can walk through this.
And honestly, I found this part to be really confusing. He just did it, but I don't know why he did. Like, it didn't make sense on what he was doing. So
yeah, well, that's kind of an important thing to see, quite honestly. But so let me do the first one, and I'll explain it to you. So I'm going to pick, and I'm going to go back to just using my original tables, because the queries that I had created were based on my original tables. So I'm not going to use these that I just created. Those were just to demo the process of importing. But you have to first select the tables that you want to create a relationship to. So I'm going to go back to table 2. It's on page 118. And so for the cookie table, there's a field in there, as I explained earlier, called cat ID. And this is a value that you're going to associate with the category ID in the category table. And what this will allow us to do is, for any cookie, we then can go look up the name of the category because we know what the ID is. So thing is, think about if you had to do this manually and you were, let's say, working in Excel, and you had one tab that was called cookie and another tab that was called category, right? So in the cookie table, you'd say, okay, I know that this category is TN001. So how am I going to figure out what the name of that category is? Well, I'm going to take this value and I'm going to go to the category table and I'm going to look it up, and here it is, and here's the name, 1 pound tin container. Well, when we write queries, we're going to tell Access to do that work for us. We're going to say, hey, here's an ID, you go look up in the other table, and then you tell me what the name of that thing is, and it's going to give us this name. But before we can do that, we've got to create a relationship between those two tables, because we need to tell Access how those tables are related. It can't figure it out on its own. It doesn't care that the field names are the same. This is cat ID in the cookie table, and it's cat ID in the category table. It doesn't care that those fields are named the same. It does not make an assumption that says, I bet those two things are somehow related. Because you'll see an example later when we get to the checkout table where the fields is named differently in two tables. So the field name itself doesn't establish a relationship. That's why you have to go through this relationships window to do that. So I'm going to add back to my relationships window.
So I have a question, just real quick. Was there anything in like the homework and looking at the assignment that would go, that we would be able to identify going, oh, I know that these need to have a relationship, or we're just like supposed to intuitively know? I guess
The
like
first,
when you were looking at it to go, oh, I know that I need to create a relationship between these two because the assignment says this, this, and this.
well, the first thing you do look at, quite honestly, is you do look at the field names, because if you design a database the right way, you will have named those two fields the same. This way, somebody who's looking at those two tables will say, I bet there's some kind of relationship between them. When you really understand is when you get to writing the queries, because, for example, if they said, I want a list of the cookies, and included in that list, I want to see what the category name is. Well, now you know category name is not part of the cookie table. So you know I'm going to have to look that up in some other table. So as you examine the fields, you say, I see category ID here, right? And this represents the category type, and I know that I have that in the category table. So that's how you kind of intuit that there's going to be a relationship between those two fields. When you see fields that are named the same, you should suspect that there's probably going to be some sort of a relationship between them. It's not always the case, it's not 100%, because as I said, if in the checkout table, there's a field called checkout ID, and then in the sales table, that same field is referred to as a ref number. So that helps point out some of that as well, okay? So in this, okay? And when you see them in this way, it stands out a little bit, right? Here's cat ID and cat ID. So to create a relationship, you simply drag the field from the primary key table, which in this case is category, and I drop it on top of the field in the other table. And then you see this dialog comes up. So it says, I want to relate the cat ID in the category table to the cat ID in the cookie table. Later on in the instructions, and I think this was on page, well, it doesn't have a page number, but it's 123. Let's see. What's that? Trying to find this exact spot here. Okay, I can't find it right now, but somewhere in the instructions there was an explicit reference to this particular box here, enforce referential integrity.
Uh-huh.
You said somewhere in the instructions that you should enforce, oh, here it is on page 125. The page that says implementation concerns. In that first paragraph, under the heading implementation concerns, it says when you create relationships, make sure to enforce referential integrity. So that's how I know that I'm going to need to check this box. Okay. Now, what referential integrity means is once I check this box, if I try to create a record in the cookie table that has a category ID that doesn't actually exist in the category table, Access will not let me create the record. So what that means is I cannot create a record that has an invalid category. That's essentially what that means. From getting into the database. If I were able to create a record in this cookie table and I had a cat ID of 123 and that category ID didn't exist in the category table, then how would I know what the category was? It would come up empty. So that's what checking that enforce referential integrity box does, is it makes sure that I can't put garbage basically into the table. So once I've checked that box, I click create, and then it shows me that there's a relationship, and I always like to look at it. Here's the little infinity symbol. This means that this relationship associated with many cookie records. So that's all that relationship indicates to us. So once I have the relationship created, now going back to, let's go back to, let's look at page, I wish these were all numbered. Let's look at page 119. And I'm looking at table 4, the checkout table structure. So as I scan down that table, I notice that there is a cookie ID field and a seller ID field. Okay, so when I look at the cookie table, there is this field CID, and that is essentially the cookie ID. So here's a case where I've got a field in the checkout table that's called cookie ID, but it actually is related to this field here, CID. And the reason I know that is when we created the cookie table, it said this is the cookie ID that uniquely identifies these records. So this is a case where this is not the greatest database design, because if I were doing this, I would have called this field cookie ID, because it can be confusing to call it CID in one table, but then call it cookie ID in another table. Okay, let me look at the checkout table, right? So here's where I'm calling it cookie ID here, but I'm calling it CID here. That's generally not considered to be good design, but it is what it is, right? So we have this database. This is what we imported from Excel, so we just have to make do with the fact that those two fields are named differently. And then if I look at the sales table, or the seller table rather, I notice that in my checkout table, here's a seller ID, and that's going to match up nicely with seller ID in this table. So sometimes the fields are named properly and they're the same. In other cases, like with the cookie ID, here it's called cookie ID, but in the cookie table it's called cookie ID. Okay,
so is it true then that just by looking at the tables, if they're named the same, or like that one, it's named a little bit different, then they should be, relationships need to be made between them?
Exactly. So if I want to create this relationship now, I'm going to right click, I'm going to show table, and I'm going to add the checkout table. And I'm also going to add the seller table, because I'm going to need that one as well. I'll explain why in just a second. Okay, so when I look at the checkout table and I see this cookie ID, once again, if somebody said, I want to see a list of all the cookies that were checked out, and I want to show the name of the cookie, I don't see cookie name in this field, in this table at all, do I? So to get that cookie name, I'm going to have to look it up in this table. So that's, again, an inclination of sort of being, and because I do this all the time, I'm being forward looking. But when you got to write your queries and it says, show me a list of all the checkouts during September, and I want to see the name of the cookie included, that's your clue that, hey, I've got to get this cookie name from another table. And so therefore, I'm going to have to create a relationship between these tables. Okay. Again, it's a lot cleaner when you name the fields the same, because it's pretty evident that there's going to be a relationship between them. Okay, but to create the relationship, I do it the same way. I'm going to take the field here from the primary key table, in this case it's cookie, and I'm going to drag it on top of cookie ID. So I see I'm relating the CID field from cookie to the cookie ID from checkout. I'm going to check this box again because the instructions indicated we needed to do that, and I'll create a relationship. Sometimes these relationship windows can start to get a little ugly, so you can move things around to clean them up. Okay. The other field in this checkout table is the seller ID. So again, I need to make an association, because if there's a query that says, I want to see all the checkouts that were done, and I want to see the name of the seller, or the student in this case, you notice that I don't have seller first name or seller last name in this table at all. So where do I get it? I have to get it from here. And how do I get that? I'm going to relate seller ID to seller ID. Now I can go and take a seller ID here, look it up in this table, and I can identify the first and last name, and if I wanted to relate it with the seller. Okay, so when you create the relationships, you always go from the table that has the primary key field. So I'm going to drag this across on top of seller ID. So I want to make sure that these two are correct. I pick the right fields, I check the box, and I click complete. Here's where sometimes your relationship windows can start to get a little dirty looking. Okay. And then if you flip the page to 120, and you look in the sales table structure, you're going to see the ref number. And I saw that in the field description it says matches the checkout ID from the checkout table. So here he was explicit in identifying the fact that the ref no field in the sales table is related to the checkout ID field in the checkout table. That's how I knew that those two were related. I would have not guessed based on field names that those two were related. Okay, so he identified that for us. So what we need to do then is I have to add the sales table here. Okay, and the ref no. So the ref no is this checkout ID, right? So this is the primary key table in this case. I'm going to drag this and drop it on top of ref no. So here the field names are different, unfortunately, but it is what it is. Box. Okay. And then I also see in the sales table that there is a seller ID field. Okay. So I'm going to have to take seller ID and drop it on top of seller ID. Create. Okay. So again, sometimes these relationship windows get kind of hard to read, so you can move things around if it helps. You can also double click on any of these lines to see what the exact field relationship is. Okay. In case it's not obvious from all these lines on the diagram. So does that make sense, or do I need to do some further explanation of why we're doing this and how we're doing this?
It makes sense. It looks like I'm looking at the chat, looking at everyone else.
Okay. So he basically just threw these out here and started whipping together, and then said, "Here it is," and didn't explain it. Is that what I'm getting?
Yes, very much so.
Okay. All right, I'm going to click save here at the top to save my relationships, and then we can close this window. You can always get back to it by going to Database Tools and Relationships if you want to return back to that window. Okay. So a form is, think of that as a data entry screen, basically. When you create tables, you really don't want people going in to your tables and modifying data, because you can easily make a mistake and think you're working in this row and you're actually in this row. And all of a sudden you start making changes. And once you commit the changes, there's no undo. When you make a change to a record in an Access table, you can't Control Z and undo your mistake. The only way you can fix your mistake is to go to last night's backup, pray to God that you actually have last night's backup, and then restore that record from from the backup from the prior evening. So we don't want people working in tables because it's ugly and they make mistakes. Instead, we create what are called forms, and these forms are data entry screens. Records and so forth. Okay. How much did he explain about forms, if anything?
He just quickly went through it, but I didn't really understand why we were doing it, but you just explained why you would do it.
Right, okay, so I'm going to get rid of these. When you want to create a form based on a table, you first select the table. So this is page 121. So the first form that they're showing is we're going to create a seller form. So I'm going to select the seller table. In fact, I'm going to get rid of these other tables because they're starting to bother me. Let's get rid of these. Okay. So I'm back to my original table. So I'm just single clicking the seller table. I'm not double clicking. I select it. I go up to the Create tab, and I click on the Form button. And you can see there's a bunch of different options. Form button is used to create a form based on the table. Form design will bring you into a raw design form, which allows you to create a form from scratch. A form wizard can walk you through steps and allow you to select data and so forth in order to do that. But we're just going to do a form in this case. So what it does is it reads the underlying fields in the table and then creates a form field for each of those. So if we look at the seller table, we can see there's a seller ID, first name, last name, and grade. Seller ID, first name, last name, and grade. So that's all it does. Reads the underlying table definition and builds you a form for data entry. Okay, now the one thing that you'll have to do as I'm looking at the form, you'll notice that he's changed identification number with a colon after it. So what we'll need to do is change these field names slightly to match the design that he's showing on page 121. Okay. So some of the things here that appear on the screen, right? So for example, you notice that the title of this form says seller because it takes its table's name. We're going to need to change this to say seller form because that's what shows up on page 121, right? So we're back to design view. Now what's probably going to happen is we see this seller ID field. It's probably not wide enough to support all the text. We need to type seller identification number colon. So what I want to do first of all is make those fields a little bit bigger so that we have enough room. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to shrink these first. So when I click on this one, When I press and hold the control key, I can then select the other. Again, I just pick one, press and hold control, and then I can select the other fields. And the reason I'm doing this is now I can resize these all at one time. Okay, so you see I've now made the box where the data is smaller, which now gives me more room for the label that identifies what that box is. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so these are called labels because they just identify what data is actually in this, and this is known as a text box. So for a label, if I just double click on the label, I get into edit mode. So then I can just type in here what I need. Double click on this one. Now the only thing I need to do with this is just put some spaces here. And then click over again. This one, same thing. And then for grade, it looks like all I need to actually do is just put a colon. Okay. This is also a label. So if I just double click, I can type the word form afterwards. If I just click off here. So now if I go back and look at it, so now it's the seller form and it says all the fields the right way. Now what's really cool about the forms is down below, you see on the screen here, we've got a couple of features. We've got a record navigator. So this tells me that there are 45 records in the seller database because I see one of 45. If I want to scroll through them, I can use these navigation buttons. So I can go to the next record, or I can go to the very last record. I can go to the previous record or to the very first record. And if I want to add a brand new record, I would click this button here. It would basically give me a blank screen where I can go ahead and type in. So it's pretty robust, and really all you did is selected a table and clicked on form. You've got this form built, for you. So Access is pretty powerful in terms of giving you these tools without having to do any coding. And that's really the objective with it is you should be able to create a somewhat sophisticated database without really having to write any code whatsoever. Okay. Now, you can write code and you can make things a lot more sophisticated, but obviously that's beyond the scope of what we need to do here. Okay. So I'm going to close this and save the changes. And let's just call this seller form. Okay, down here. Do the same for the cookie. I'm going to select the cookie table, create form. Okay.